middle-class men are the arbiters of how Scottish politics should be conducted, because that's basically what's going on. And they are trying to maintain the status quo because that maintains their power base. And until we actually dismantle the cosy consensus and allow the voices that aren't usually heard to come forward in centre stage, and that we actually recreate how politics is conducted in this country, then the status that we have at the moment with falling turnout and increasing numbers, particularly of young people disenchanted and disenfranchised, will continue. But, it suits those who say, oh, this is how it should be conducted, and it should all be polite, and it should all be done in the way that we think is right and proper. And some of that as well you could see that in some of the reaction to the riots in London in the summer, not last year, the year before, about how awful this was. And actually, people like myself and folk like Paul Mason, there was something quite exhilarating about, it was wrong, fundamentally wrong, for young people and people of all ages to be looting and committing crimes. But there was actually also something exhilarating about people feeling angry enough to take a stand and actually reclaiming their streets and reclaiming their right to make their voices heard. And, the reason they did it in such a violent way and dissonant way is because they are fundamentally excluded from using the other institutional mechanisms that exist. And if they were given access to them and power was shared more equitably, then things like riots wouldn't happen. And you actually wouldn't also have the kind of sushi that we had when Nigel Farage came. And actually, he just wouldn't even bother coming because he would know that he's just not welcome.
Can I just, as a disclaimer, say that I do not endorse the wisdom of repugnance theory? Sorry, because I'm aware how that sounded before, but I just think it's an interesting area. But you might say I'm disgusted by it.
Well, of course, and just to end that point there, because you were the one that brought up political philosophy, Michael, but I remember that Machiavelli, in the Discorsi on Livy, talked about how the liberty of the Roman Republic depended upon the social friction and the riotous assemblies which united the people on one hand and the patrician class on the other, that actually disorderly democracy was not, in his view, something which was the foe of liberty, but was a way of asserting it. And there may be something about that for contemporary Scotland too, I think. Machiavelli is not always the most cited figure, but he wasn't just limited to the cynicism of the prince.
Yeah, well, I've had a very Machiavellian thought this week. I was debating whether I'm going to say it on the podcast, but I'll just say it's another one of these things I'm not sure. The thought occurred. It doesn't mean you have to follow every thought you have. When you're standing next to a cliff, there's still a primeval part of your brain that says, jump! You don't have to listen to every thought you have. But the thought that occurred this week was just, should we stop worrying about winning the debate and just get on with winning the bloody referendum?
Well, yes, I think that's a good point. I think there's, for me, one of the untold questions of this campaign. I'll ask Kate what you think about this in a minute, but in fact, it is about folk in their communities talking to people one by one, group by group, and we don't get any sense of that. The whole debate is conducted at this rather high level of a small group of folk discussing essentially which campaign's news releases are better. And I think that is a kind of attenuating thing, which is actually quite a separate question to, well, who's maybe setting up the structures, the campaigning structures on the ground, not just the press rooms and the comms teams, to win this debate. Kate, I wonder, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's more than an element of truth in Michael's heretic thought, really. And actually, that could apply, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, that could apply to the Nicola Sturgeon-Michael Moore debate. With regard to the structures and the activity on the ground, I actually think that's what Yes Scotland is doing. And actually now, Better Together are copying the model of community groups and grassroots meetings and campaign activity happening at a very low-level community base. They're going around the country mopping up behind, if you like, Yes Scotland and copying their methodology. There are hundreds of Yes campaigns operating at local level, and the ones that I have any contact with at all seem to be working pretty well. And they're also bringing in people who are not your usual suspects in terms of party political activity, and they're getting on with the job of exactly that, talking, leafleting, doing street stalls, having conversations with people, engaging their neighbours, actually answering the questions and the doubts that people have. And from what the feedback I get, and even just from my own conversations with people, some of the panels and meetings that I've been to, there's huge interest out there in the population at large, if you like, of people wanting to have the discussions and have the debate and go over and mull it over and feel that they can make an informed choice. And I do think that actually, yes, Scotland is fulfilling that part of its remit rather well.
Michael, maybe Kate mentioned it there. This week we had the debates on STV on Scotland Tonight. This week between Nicola Sturgeon and Michael Moore, the Lib Dem Secretary of State. I think most people thought that poor Michael Moore, who it's not really his forte, got quite hammered by Sturgeon. But I was more interested, I suppose, not in what they were saying, but about the wider impact that these kind of media events can have. I think people are often quite sneery and quite unfair to STV in terms of its coverage. I think during the 2011 election in Holyrood, they did much better than the BBC did in terms of covering the debate. And actually, for me, in the independence campaign, they're showing a lot more signs of life, more signs of thought, more signs of creative ways of trying to cover this campaign and create new spaces for conversation. I wonder, did you see the debate, Michael, and what did you think about it on those kind of themes that I was mentioning?
I actually just watched it just before we started this, and before that I watched the BBC one, and before that I watched FMQs. You know how Kate said she had some time off from Scottish politics? Well, after this podcast, that's me for the weekend, but No, I thought that STV's version of the debate thing was much better than BBC one. The BBC had a rather interesting take on it, having like foreigners who've come to live in Scotland as the audience. I thought was an interesting way to do it. And most of them seemed to be pro-independence. It was quite strange. But Sturgeon clearly won the debate. I quite enjoyed the format. STV improving. A little thing that got my hackles up was the use of the term halftime and post-match analysis. Come on, we're not talking about the football here. And the other thing I found was strange was since when did the thing politicians always try to make gestures with their hands, and they're all trained to do this now. But when did journalists start doing that? Bernard Ponsonby was doing it, and the guy from Radio Clyde was doing it as well. I mean, we've all seen the documentaries where it's important in a power setting to get the last touch, and there's a brilliant scene. There's a brilliant scene with Bush and Clinton where they're both just constantly patting each other to get the last touch. It's kind of funny, but since when did journalists start doing that as well? The Americanization is one area I was going to ask you about, Andrew, because yes, it's certainly what STV did is more of an American form, but I don't think it came off too badly.
No, I think, I don't know if, just to explain if anyone didn't see it, that there was an opportunity after initial opening statements for Sturgeon and for Michael Moore to pose each other questions for a limited period of time, decided on a coin toss about who went first. And I think that kind of mutual interrogation directly by politicians of one another is quite an American touch to the whole thing. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Michael Moore certainly winced in the face of Nicola's rather brutal questions, it must be said. But I would put this caveat about it. The point scoring that you alluded to, Michael, and this sort of brief Americanization, a burst of 5 minutes of questions, don't actually inform you very much about the issues. I mean, that debate between Sturgeon and Moore was primarily about the economy. It mostly talked about currency. I emerged knowing more or less what I knew going in about currency and the economy. And the whole format is much actually better treated to a kind of point scoring, who won on points, as I think Bernard Ponsonby said explicitly using a boxing metaphor. So I do worry up to a point that the polarization and the sort of prowess assessment of which candidate, which representative put in a better job of making their case doesn't actually help us answer the question of, well, whose case is fundamentally better? And so that was one of the things which I had some anxieties about in terms of this STV wheeze, which otherwise I thought was an interesting addition to the whole scene. I wonder, Kate, you were saying that your pals came over to see it. What did you all make of that debate?
Yeah. A number of points. I would agree wholeheartedly about STV actually coming up with innovative formats and really trying to push forward in terms of combining mainstream media with social media in terms of how they cover current affairs. And I think one of the most exciting projects that they've got involved with is the stuff in schools on the referendum, and I think that's brilliant, and they're to be commended on that. And also just
Kate, could you just explain what that is? Because I actually don't think I know quite what they've been doing in that area. So maybe you could just enlighten me.
It's Debating Matters. That's what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Institute of Ideas. STV has teamed up with this organisation called Debating Matters to give secondary school pupils across Scotland the opportunity to debate the big issues in the run-up to the referendum on Scottish independence. And it's a Scotland-wide competition open to, admittedly, secondary 5th and 6th year pupils. And they will be able to take part in preliminary rounds. And then there's going to be regional heats and semi-finals and then a final in spring 2014. And it's fantastic because there's a resource hub and there's a whole lot of topic guides and guidance on how to get involved. The only thing I would say is that children from primary one should be involved in this debate because it's all about their future. And we should be encouraging children to look at the options and hold their own mock elections and debates and even just cover the topics themselves, because even though under 16s are not going to have the vote, they're the ones ultimately who live with the outcome of what we decide next September. But I think Debating Matters is an important step forward and well played to STV for being prepared to get involved with it, and they're going to obviously televise some of it as well, which is going to be fantastic, having young people on our TV screens debating the independence referendum and the issues connected with it. I quite enjoyed Newsnight's latest panel debate. I didn't find it so much strange that so many new Scots actually support independence. I think that's quite telling, actually, in terms of where the cringe sits and who it sits with, as to whether or not we should be going alone. And I don't find it surprising that people who were either born elsewhere or have experience of living elsewhere have come and made their lives in Scotland and decided that actually independence is nothing to be scared of and something to be embraced. I thought it helped that we had a slightly different panel, and I think that they all treated each other with respect, and I found it quite interesting, and I thought there were some really good questions came out of that panel. So I think in terms of BBC coverage of kind of debate formats today, that one raised the bar a little bit. With regard to the STV debate, it was brilliant. It was actually first-class television. Yes, they bought in wholesale the American formula. I don't think the talking heads thing worked all that well in terms of the analysis. I do think how it was all portrayed as half-time and post-match, and then an awful lot about Nicola Sturgeon having him on the ropes and delivering knockout blows, utterly masculine and macho in how it's being portrayed, and a big turn-off, frankly, to most women and probably quite a lot of men as well, in terms of how it's being portrayed. Nicola absolutely bossed all of it, actually. She looked relaxed, she looked like she was enjoying herself, and she destroyed him on the cross-examination. But the fundamental thing for me is that it was a continuation of debating things on a very narrow basis and about trying to win the kind of battle du jour rather than actually win the bigger picture. And you know, to have so much of a debate purportedly about the economy fixated on the currency is kind of missing the point. I know that she had to kind of debate on the terms that were set out for the programme, but there is just something about turning that around into talking about what we would do with the money in our pocket, whatever colour it's going to be, and how we will make that work for us better. And I do think we are still so confined to very narrow issues about the debate that are actually fairly small beer in the scheme of things about what's going to persuade people to vote yes for independence.
Michael, you just watched the show. What do you make of it?
Yeah,